So what's really neat about our universe and what scientists have discovered, especially over the last 100, 150 years, is all of these laws of physics, these constants, sometimes they're called, of the universe, that seem to be set just right so that life can exist within this universe. So you can almost imagine a control room, right? Imagine a control room, if you will, with a lot of dials in it. And it's almost as though our universe has such a control room where all the dials have been set to a very specific degree so that life could exist. And if any of the dials were just turned one little fraction of a hair to the left or to the right, our universe would not be able to sustain life. Now there's over 100 of these constants of the universe that have been discovered so far, these fine-tuned constants. And again, if any of them were slightly different, life wouldn't be able to exist at all. So I'll give you just a couple examples of these. One of them is the gravitational constant, okay? The gravitational constant of our universe. If it was different by this slight amount, then the sun could not exist, and the moon would crash into Earth or shear off into outer space. So the gravitational constant seems to be one of those things in our universe that was finely tuned or designed such that life could exist. Another one is the expansion rate of the universe. We talked a bit last week about the Big Bang, and it seems as though science has discovered that the universe began out of a point of singularity or out of a really nothingness. The universe came into existence out of nothing and was brought into existence through a process which scientists call the Big Bang. But there's an aspect, the expansion rate of the universe, when it came out of that singularity, it's been expanding ever since. That's one of the things that was detected in the early 1900s, which convinced scientists that the universe had a beginning. Because if the universe is expanding, right, ultimately if you turn the clock backward, it comes back together to a singularity, universe coming from nothing, basically. But this expansion rate, the rate at which the universe expands, had to have been set just right. And this was a big discovery by scientist George Smoot in the 1990s. He actually won the Nobel Prize for this discovery. But one of the things he discovered is that this expansion rate had to be just perfect. Not too much, right? The expansion rate of the universe couldn't be too much, or matter could never congregate together into galaxies, stars, and planets. But it also couldn't be too little, or else the universe would have collapsed back in on itself. Right? So this expansion rate of the universe had to be set just right. This is one of the reasons why Stephen Hawking called this discovery the greatest scientific discovery of all time. Here's a quote from Stephen Hawking. You might recognize him, very well-known scientist from Oxford. Hawking wrote, "Why did the universe start out with so nearly the critical rate of expansion that separates models that recollapse from those that go on expanding forever? That even now, 10,000 million years later, it's still expanding at nearly the critical rate. If the rate of expansion 1 second after the Big Bang had been smaller by even 1 part in 100,000 million, the universe would have collapsed before it ever reached its present size." Now, these are just 2 examples of constants in our universe, physical constants, that seem to have been set just right so that life could thrive, could exist in our universe. And there's over 100 such fine-tuned constants that have led people to conclude that the universe shows signs of being designed. Here's a quote from a well-known astronomer, Arno Penzias. He was one of the co-discoverers of the radiation afterglow of the Big Bang, also won a Nobel Prize. But look at what he wrote. He said, astronomy leads us to a unique event, a universe which was created out of nothing and delicately balanced to provide exactly the conditions required to support life. In the absence of an absurdly improbable accident, the observations of modern science seem to suggest an underlying, one might even say, supernatural plan. Now, why does he say supernatural? Does he believe in ghosts and goblins? That's what we usually think of when we think of supernatural, right? No, all he means by that is that it seems like this design must have come from outside of nature. Because nature is what we're talking about that shows evidence of design. And if nature, i.e. nature just being space, time, and matter, that's what the universe is, space, time, and matter, that's nature. And if all that came from nothingness, the design or the cause of that must be outside of nature. That's all he means by supernatural. And I would agree. It seems to indicate that something before the universe, before nature, before space, time, and matter, designed it to exist the way that it does, the universe. What we want to look at, and again, there's many of these arguments, but the last one we want to look at this morning is the design of life, biological life. Now, as you can imagine, this particular argument isn't as popular or I guess I could say compelling to people today, mostly because of evolution, right? Mostly because of evolution, this argument doesn't have the same sort of force that the other ones do. But we're going to talk through that issue. However, even though it might not be as compelling, might not be as powerful as the other design arguments, I think it's still quite effective. In fact, this particular design argument was one of the major reasons that one of the most famous atheists from the 20th century, Antony Flew, changed his mind and became a theist, or you could say deist in his case, but came to the conclusion that there is in fact a supreme being. And it was in large part due to this particular design argument, the design of life. So it is still good to be familiar with it, and we'll walk through this design argument from life. So let's start out just thinking about the simplest form of life, right? A single-celled organism. Now, 100 years ago, scientists thought the cell was basically just a blob of protoplasm, right? They weren't very impressed by the cell. And so for them, these scientists 100 years ago or so, for them, it was very easy in their minds to think that, well, maybe many years ago, chemicals came together in some sort of primordial goop and just accidentally formed a cell. Because again, they didn't realize how complex the cell actually is. They thought it was just a blob of protoplasm. But over the last 100, 120 years, while telescopes have allowed us to understand our universe in that much more detail, our microscopes have been developed such that we can dig down into the cell and see how complex it really is. It's not a simple blob of protoplasm. The cell is actually a factory that is building other factories. So even a single-celled organism is highly complex. Now again, I'm not a scientist, so I have to lean on professional scientists for a lot of these details, but Stephen Barr in that book does a great job walking through the scientific discoveries which have strengthened this argument for the design of life. One of these scientific discoveries was the discovery of DNA. So in the 1950s, DNA was confirmed to contain genetic information. So bottom line, DNA includes encoded instructions for how to build all living things. It's a language. DNA is an entire language built on a 4-letter alphabet. Now you might say, well, that's not very sophisticated, 4-letter alphabet. I mean, we in English, we have a 26-letter alphabet. But consider, right, that computers and everything that computers can do is based on a 2-letter alphabet, zeros and ones. So a 4-letter language can accomplish quite a bit. And that's what DNA is. It's a 4-letter alphabet, a language built on a 4-letter alphabet. In fact, talking about computers, Bill Gates said that DNA is the most efficient language and storage device in the universe. DNA as a language is a very striking example, as we've discussed. Language is a very stark example of design because there's specified complexity to it. So think about just that single-celled organism again. How much information is written in the DNA of a simple single-celled organism? Take a look at this quote from Stephen Barr again. He wrote, "Even a bacterium, single-celled organism, the simplest kind of living thing, has, according to molecular biologists, an enormously complicated structure. By some reckonings, it would take as great a quantity of information as there is in the Encyclopedia Britannica to describe all the parts of a bacterium and how they are put together." That's how much information is packed into the DNA of the simplest form of life, a single-celled organism. Now, those of you in the younger generation, encyclopedias were these books where if you wanted to learn something, they were categorized alphabetically. You had to go look it up in an actual paper book. But we're talking like, took a shelf this big, A through Z. So language, specified complexity. That's why some people argue that DNA is actually one of the strongest evidences of design. Here's a quote from another scientist, Stephen Meyer, who got his PhD from Cambridge University. Dr. Meyer wrote, "Our uniform experience affirms that specified information, whether inscribed hieroglyphics, language, ancient language, written in a book, encoded in a radio signal, like that movie Contact, or produced in a simulation experiment, always arises from an intelligent source. We've just never seen language or information or design come from anything but a mind and not a strictly material process." This is just an empirical observation. We've just never seen information, language, design come from any other source but an intelligent mind, a designer, if you will. That's why I think this conclusion is very reasonable, that the universe, that earth, and that biological life itself has a designer.